Are we trying to embrace China? Do we think that they are our saviour from zero growth? Or do we think that they're spies?
But to some extent, it reflects the fact that Britain has been weak at investing in these key critical areas ourselves. This whole thing with British Steel, it is, I think, a humbling moment for the British state in a lot of ways.
It's a micro problem. But on a macro level, it's kind of going to, whoa, hang on, maybe we shouldn't trust the Chinese. The Chinese are on a charm offensive. They would like the rest of the world to see them as the free trade champions, the people who obey the rules of world trade and are to be trusted more than the Americans.
But this weekend, the government was forced to take direct control of British Steel amid concern that Beijing had bad intentions. Ministers actually fear the company was planning to sabotage the whole site in order to feed us Chinese steel at a much cheaper price. So should we trust them or should we run a mile? Welcome to the News Agents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And it sounds like there are ambulances with their blue lights flashing and sirens blaring, rushing towards Scunthorpe with coking coal and iron ore to keep open a steel plant, the only one left in Britain where virgin steel is made. And it comes as the government is essentially saying, or seems coming close to be saying, we don't trust the good faith of the Chinese owners of this company, and that's why we're having to pull every string possible to try to keep the Scunthorpe blast furnaces open.
There have been some pretty extraordinary accusations running around over the last 48 hours, some of which have been offered a bit gingerly from the government, but which nonetheless are still there. Basically, I mean, the reason, there is still, as we're sat here now, a question mark over whether, despite the fact that, as Emily said, the government has taken over the day-to-day running of this works, there is still a question mark as to whether or not the blast furnaces can be kept online, because you need those essential raw materials, John, that you just spoke about, the limestone, the coking coal and so on, to get there. And there is, and has been made, the accusation that the Chinese company, Xingye, purposefully played for time to allow those raw materials to run down and slowly deplete, to put the plant in a situation where they knew that those blast furnaces would not be able to remain online. And it seems to be that the crunch moment did come when Johnny Reynolds, the business secretary, basically drew that conclusion in its negotiations with Xingye last week and went to the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, and said they're not going to accept any offer that we give them because basically they want to run those raw materials down. And the extra accusation comes, which the government hasn't made directly but has alluded to, but certainly China hawks have been making, which is to say, the accusation goes that the Chinese state itself, involved as it is with all of its big companies like Xingye, basically wanted to destroy British steel production because it would make us reliant on China.
Yeah, the government itself hasn't gone as far as saying that, but the Alliance on China, which is a kind of interparliamentary group, has basically spelled it out and said it's an explicit strategy of the Chinese Communist Party to undermine the industrial base of foreign countries. To spell that out, what are they saying? They're saying that they think China comes into Britain, tries to take over, commandeer companies that we can no longer afford to run properly. And instead of investing in them, keeping the jobs going, keeping production going, they try and basically mothball what is going on because they don't want us to produce our own steel. In other words, they want to produce steel much more cheaply. They want to then flood the markets of Europe and the UK with their steel, particularly given everything that's going on in the tariff war with America. This is looking like a more and more attractive strategy. And I think the problem with the recognition or the half recognition that maybe it's sabotage or maybe it's some kind of attempt to run us down is you're then left asking a really big question, which is, why is the Chancellor going to China to drum up business? Why is Douglas Alexander, the Secretary for Business, their trade right now? Why is Keir Starmer talking about going, and you've heard this idea of rolling out the red carpet for our Prime Minister? Are we trying to embrace China? Do we think that they are our saviour from zero growth? Or do we think that they're spies? Because you can't really have it both ways, can you?
Well, that's the thing. I think the government wants to have it both ways. I think the government wants to be able to do as much trade as possible with China, where it's not going to be the kind of roller coaster ride that we've had in America over the past 2 weeks with tariffs up, tariffs down, exclusions, inclusions, and all the rest of it. And I think they can. But I think there is a growing realization, and maybe the scales have fallen from the eyes over what has happened with Xinye, is that actually, crikey, can we have strategic infrastructure being owned by the Chinese and at a whim opened or closed by the Chinese? And I think that is the real fundamental question that Britain has never really wanted to grapple with, whether it be over nuclear power, whether it be over telecoms infrastructure, things that America have taken a firm stance on in the past. We haven't so much.
It's moved a long way very quickly, right? You don't have to go back that far. You have to go back to 2018, 2019. Theresa May government at the time. They wanted Huawei, Chinese company, to be the provider of our 5G network. They were going to invest a huge amount of money in Britain. It was only the Americans that stopped it. It was the first Trump government administration which stopped it. And so then you fast forward to 2020, and the Boris Johnson government allows Xinye to buy British steel. So Britain, of all of the Western nations, has been especially open for a long time to all forms of foreign investment, including foreign states, including the Chinese state, even over matters of national infrastructure. And actually, it wouldn't just be the Americans that would be resistant about that. It would also be other European countries, the French and the Germans in particular. But to some extent, it reflects the fact that Britain has been weak at investing in these key critical areas ourselves. Like, we're having this discussion about British steel and why it isn't surviving. One of the reasons it hasn't survived, there's been a lot of discussion about, is it net zero, all of this sort of stuff. One of the reasons it hasn't, it's true, our electricity costs are really high, industrial electricity costs by comparison to other countries. But one of the reasons for that is not just because of net zero, it's because government after government, for decade after decade, has tried to do British power on the cheap, and has not, like, for example, like the French invested in nuclear energy, or hasn't, like the Germans, invested in energy storage, right? And so as a result, what do? We invite countries like the Chinese to do it in our stead because it keeps it off the public balance sheet. So to some extent, the Chinese issue is important, but it's part of a wider, longer story of Britain trying to do things on the cheap, and we all pay the price for it in the long run.
I mean, you and I remember the Cameron Osborne days, which was the real embrace of China. We were Sino-focused in a way we had never been before. I remember going around the Huawei factory with George Osborne, and he told me kind of, with relish, Britain was at the centre of the Chinese banquet table. We were heralded, we were love-bombed, all the rest of it. And when you look at where it's got us to now, and it is water, it is rail, it is gas, to some extent, you can't just sell off the family silver and then kind of turn around and blame the buyer, right? You can't say, oh, well, that's all going to be done for us by China or, other countries. But I think it was predominantly China at that point. And then turn around and say, well, why are you doing this? Why are you coming in? Why are you spying on our stuff? And of course it is. It's down to a deindustrialisation of Britain right across the board, which started obviously in the 70s with coal and 80s with Thatcher and all the rest of it. And it's left us with no real recourse to make our own stuff, right? We've admitted that we're not really a manufacturing country anymore. I mean, the government wouldn't admit that, but I think fundamentally we are not. We don't make nearly as much stuff as we used to, and that's clear. And the fact that actually they've stepped in on Scunthorpe, they haven't stepped in on Port Talbot, they didn't step in on Wales, they haven't stepped in on similar Scottish, parts of the infrastructure like that, kind of tells you that this is a panic moment, right? This isn't a strategy; it's a panic.
I think the government were surprised from conversations I've had. I think they really thought they would be able to reach a deal with Xinye, and were surprised when it became clear. I mean, they were throwing everything at it. They offered them £500 million, right, of various investment and subsidy to sort of just keep, and they offered to buy all the raw materials as well, and they thought that would be enough. Xinye were coming back and saying, we want £1 billion just to keep the thing going, and it became clear very quickly that they just weren't interested. Just on the Chinese element and this sort of idea of potential sabotage. Some of the reports have come out over the weekend of extraordinary stories and scenes, right, taking place at Scunthorpe, of workers at the plant, British workers at the plant, preventing access to Chinese executives because they were convinced that the Chinese executives were going to commit some act of sabotage, or they were going to try and do something to ensure that those raw materials couldn't arrive. So this is it's a really weird thing that's unfolded over the last 48 hours, which on one level is a really micro story about a small town in North Lincolnshire on one small steel plant, which in the grand scheme of things really doesn't matter in global terms. It's just a drop in the ocean of global steel production, right? It doesn't matter that much in global terms. But it's being brought forward, this geopolitical tension, which is now being brought forward, which you can see and have you heard from Johnny Reynolds and ministers over the last couple of days. They're struggling to perfect that delicate dance, right? Between, on the one hand, it's very clear that we don't want them involved in our key national infrastructure anymore. But on loads of industries, which are not of national strategic significance in the same way, like cars or biosciences or all sorts of other stuff, we do want their money because their money is just unavoidable. It's so big. They're such a big part of the global economy. It's difficult.
It was so interesting that you go back to the Huawei point. I mean, I was in Washington during that period, and the intense pressure that British diplomats were feeling and having to relay back to the government at Westminster about how furious the Americans were and how they had to act on all of this. And there was also a feeling that on the British part, come on, is this really about national security, or is this just naked protectionism, naked economic nationalism? Don't buy Huawei, buy something from us instead. And I think actually you can't separate the two. But the national security piece of it, as the tensions rise geopolitically, and they are going to rise as a result of a tariff war, they become more and more important. And so, America has blocked all sorts of things. I mean, the sale of 6 ports to Dubai, and the Baltimore port was the sort of centerpiece of that. That was blocked on national security grounds. That was back in 2006. It goes on and on. There's a rich history of America saying, you can't have our bits of national infrastructure. They have to stay in American hands with American companies. I don't know whether it's protectionism. I don't know whether it's national security. But you can see why it sort of makes sense as the tensions increase. I would guess this comes at a terrible time for the Chinese government, that this has come to a head about in Scunthorpe, because exactly as you say, Lewis, it's a micro problem, but on a macro level, it's kind of going to, whoa, hang on, maybe we shouldn't trust the Chinese.
Yeah, I think actually you have to keep it in proportion, because if you look at where Xi is today, he's just started a week-long tour of Southeast Asia. He's landing in Hanoi, he's going off to Cambodia, he's doing the ASEAN convention. He's basically trying to rally other nations to Beijing's side in this America tariff war. And he's written in the Vietnamese press calling on other countries to, join with China in defending the stability of free trade. They're trying to make out essentially that they are the norm now. They are the place of stability compared to America. And I do think that we are starting to look like bystanders in all this. I mean, look at us. We're pretty isolated. We're not part of the EU. We're not part of any formal trade deal yet with America. We're all in this 10% tariffs group together now.
Yeah,
I mean,
what happened to that Brexit dividend, eh?
Yeah,
the
Less
Brexit
than a week.
dividend lasted
4
about
days.
3
We haven't
days.
heard much from those
didn't it?
lads, have we, over the last
Exactly.
week since that happened?
And you look at the difference. Like, Xi is now on his whirlwind tour, basically trying to drum up support because he is king of that whole area. And you look at what Starmer's doing today. I mean, one China expert put it to me today. This is the difference between the two of them. Starmer's inbox today is working out whether he can get coke from Japan to keep the furnace in Scunthorpe from going out. Literally. It puts us in our place a bit on that world stage.
I completely agree with that, and I think that's becoming more and more brutally clear with every passing week, I think. And actually, I mean, this is what I mean. I kind of feel this whole thing with British Steel, it is, I think, a humbling moment for the British state in a lot of ways. I mean, the fact is that we are, I mean, even taking Scunthorpe in and of itself, I mean, as we were reporting last week, it's a huge part of Scunthorpe. It's also a really old site. Those blast furnaces go back to the 1930s to the 1950s. They are in a terrible condition. They require huge amounts of investment if the site's going to have a future, particularly a future which meets our carbon targets and all of those sorts of things. We're talking about trying to, at the very last minute, because we put all of our cards with China, we're trying to scurry around the world, trying to find some coking coal, trying to find some limestone. This is the home of the Industrial Revolution. It's one of the great industrial powers of the world. And the British state is doing everything it can. It can't even have any guarantees of keeping this one steel plant online. And as I say, that is, I think, actually an indictment of long-term British industrial policy and strategy going back decades. It's not just about what's happened in the last few weeks.
Yeah, and the other thing that's happened this weekend is, of course, what's happened to Vera Hobhouse. She's a Liberal Democrat MP, goes to Hong Kong and is held, kind of arrested, questioned, deported.
She wanted to visit her grandson,
Yeah.
her newborn grandson.
And this is the Chinese state saying, sorry, I don't like some of the things you've said. I don't think some of the kind of press releases you've been involved in or the speeches you've made pass muster. Sorry, you're not getting into our country. You're on your way home. And she is deported. And of course, she's an elected parliamentarian. She's a Democrat. She's got views. But it shows the brittleness of the Chinese state, that they will not tolerate someone from Westminster who is duly elected.
In Hong Kong, of all places.
In Hong Kong, of all places, where you were one state, two systems, all that was promised with British handover to China, kind of gone.
We should say that Vera Hobhouse is raising concerns for the Chinese authorities because they think that she is part of a group that has been outspoken about the mistreatment of Uyghurs in a part of China, Xinjiang, that China likes to claim as itself, and Xinjiang is considered an autonomous region by those who live there. And while we're talking about this, there are plans afoot, if the Chinese get their way, for what we should say the Daily Mail is calling a super embassy with a secret spy dungeon in the heart of the City of London. What does that mean exactly? Well, Starmer hasn't yet actually pushed through, greenlit these plans, but he's been accused of appeasing Beijing. If he goes ahead with allowing them this super embassy, which planning documents have shown contain 2 suites of anonymous, unlabelled basement rooms and a tunnel with their exact purpose redacted for security reasons. This is next to the Tower of London. It has been blocked by previous governments. The intelligence agencies, Scotland Yard, objected on the grounds that sensitive data cables could be vulnerable to attack by Chinese spies. But I guess there is a nervousness ramping up that Starmer is in the mood to placate, pacify, certainly take the cash from the Chinese. And maybe this goes through this time around.
There's been something announced just in the last few hours about, I think it illustrates how Starmer is just going to get squeezed and squeezed and squeezed on this. He's not going to be able to perfect this balance. China's suspending exports of critical minerals, magnets, threatening to choke off supplies of components central to car manufacturers, aerospace manufacturers, semiconductor companies, military contractors around the world. China has basically cornered the market in so many of these critical minerals, as we know. This is in direct retaliation to what Trump has done. How does Starmer possibly try and perfect a balance between these two powers? He's just not going to be able to do it.
Well, in a moment, we're going to talk to Victor Gao, who is close to the Chinese state and who takes a view that Britain, we love you, but don't think you're so important.
Well, joining us now is Dr. Gao. He's the Vice President of the Centre for China and Globalisation in Beijing, was also a translator for Deng Xiaoping back in the day. Victor Gao, how do you read what is going on at the moment between China and Britain over the steel making?
British steel is a very important asset for Britain. And while the Chinese steel production is much, much larger than that, China's production is more than 1 billion tons of iron and steel every year. I personally believe Britain still continue to maintain British steel to avoid shutting down the 2 furnaces, because I understand if you shut down the furnace, it's almost impossible to restart it unless at a huge cost. And for Britain, you need to maintain whatever that remains in the iron and steel sector.
But Jingye, who bought the company, was selling off the coke and the iron ore that was vital for keeping it open. So the British government felt they had to act. Do you understand why the British government have intervened?
First of all, I'm not exactly familiar with all the background. I understand Jingye is not the first international company to take over British steel over the years or the decades. The company itself must be in very strong, very serious economic problems. And for Britain, whatever iron and steel you produce at this particular plant, the total market demand in the country may not be meaningful to hold up any production. So from today's perspective, the importance of that plant is basically for whatever that may happen in an emergent case. What if, for example, national defense would need steel to be made in Britain? So I think the Chinese company, without knowing too much about it, as a background, probably did its best to save the operation. But it's a company and it has its own balance sheet and it has to care about its own business survival. So I think it may be time for Britain to muster all the resources available in the market to save the British steel for the potential national defense contingency.
Whatever happens or doesn't happen to Jingye, it sounds as if this is about something bigger than one company, even than one industry. It's about a reset between China and Britain, which is, I think, leaving a lot of people very confused. There is alarm over Chinese involvement in other areas of critical infrastructure, nuclear power plants, and we've even had over the weekend this comment from Luke Pulford, the Executive Director of the Interparliamentary Alliance, saying it's an explicit strategy of the Chinese Communist Party to undermine the industrial base of foreign countries. Do you accept that this is Chinese foreign policy at work here?
I think the allegation is purely artificial and made up out of thin air. Why should China bother about the manufacturing capabilities in Britain other than for trading purposes, for example? And you mentioned the nuclear power station, the Hinkley. I understand there was a Chinese company very much committed to work with the French company to get it started for the benefit of the British people. However, for whatever reason, on the British side, you squeezed out the Chinese company. Now the French company could not have enough financial wherewithal to get it done. And ultimately, who suffers? The British people suffer. Britain will not have enough power for its current demand. And if you listen to the American way of promoting AI, you need double, if not even triple, the amount of power you now need to really have a meaningful role to play in artificial intelligence. So the squeezing out of the Chinese company from Hinkley, I think, with all the benefit of the hindsight, is a major blow by Britain to the interests of the British people.
So let me just ask you to imagine it the other way round. If there was British involvement in Chinese nuclear companies, if there was British involvement in steel companies, if there was British involvement in Chinese offshore wind projects that meant that the industrial strategy was basically fueling 2 million or more homes in China from British-owned enterprises, wouldn't your government be having a slight panic attack?
Not at all. With benefit of my own personal experience, while I'm not aware of major British role played in the Chinese market, the French company is very much involved in China's nuclear power sector. It actually was one of the pioneers. It actually worked with the Chinese from day one, almost, and still plays a major role as a major shareholder in the Dayao nuclear power station, very close to Hong Kong. Other foreign companies are very much involved in terms of urban utilities, water, you name it. They play different roles. You need to ask why the British are not playing a role. It's not because of pressure or opposition by the Chinese government. It probably they do not have enough financial resources, or maybe they think there are better markets for them to make the investment. My personal view is that in utilities like this, we need to have international cooperation for foreign companies coming to China as well as Chinese companies going abroad. We should not wear geopolitics all the time on our lips, as if, for example, human being will not have enough wisdom to overcome whatever problems there are and will eventually square off against each other in war. And if war breaks out, it will be nuclear war. There will be no future for mankind. We will all be annihilated by this Armageddon.
Okay.
So let's work for peace.
I'm sure everyone would say 3 cheers to working for peace. So you're arguing that we should have no concerns at all about having economic dependence on China, whether it be for blast furnaces and steel production, whether it be for nuclear power, we should just kind of say, yeah, fine, if that's the way it goes, that's the way it goes?
I think each investment is different. You need to have a very scrutiny for every aspect of the investment. For example, the background, source of the finance, and the quality of the management, etc., whether they are committed for the longer term or not. But other than that, I don't think we should really apply a geopolitical analysis to certain commercial transactions. Because if you want to see devil in the wall, you see the whole wall full of devils. And between China and Britain, we are separated by the whole Eurasian continent. And while there have been unpleasant things back in our history, the Chinese nation is very much oriented towards the future. We focus on the future, and we want to be a friend of Britain. We want to embrace the British people for mutual benefit. That is the mega trend. Don't get China wrong. And I'm personally delighted to see very high ranking official of Britain visiting in Beijing just a couple of days ago. I hope more such visits will take place and mutual benefit can be maximized based on improved, better understanding of each other.
Mr. Gao, there's a phrase I'm sure you're familiar with in English, which is pull the other one. In other words, we just don't believe, many people in this country just don't believe that China does not have a very strong vested interest in making sure that it is getting more out of this country in its investment than it is giving. Jingyi wanted to retain 4 steel mills whilst closing the furnace. This is setting off alarm bells in our government, which is that those mills would have been supplied directly with steel from China. In other words, it's a way of using a part of our industrial infrastructure to flood our country with your steel. You can't deny that's happening.
No, I completely disagree. I'm not exactly familiar with the background of Jingyi as a company, but as a rule of thumb, let me tell you, while Britain is a very important market from the Chinese perspective, Britain as a whole, or the British steel industry as a whole, are really very inconsequential as far as China is concerned on a business perspective. We deal with Australia a lot, buying a lot of ore from Australia. We deal with many other countries. China is the major provider of iron and steel products to many countries. Britain is just one of them, and it's not a very important and large-sized company. From the Chinese perspective, we value Britain. For example, lots of Chinese students are coming, tourists are coming, and people-to-people exchanges. And I do think in China, we do have an admiration for the great engineering achievements of Britain, the breakthroughs, for example. And I think this is the basis for the strong relations between China and Britain. I will be surprised if anyone in Beijing looks at Britain purely from a geopolitical perspective. No, Britain is so far away from China. We should have all the reasons to work as partners rather than suspect each other as if the other side is my arch enemy.
But there is suspicion. I mean, whether you like it or not, what has happened with Jingye is that not only were they not kind of keeping the blast furnaces supplied with the coking coal that they need, they were actively sabotaging, by the sound of it, what was needed. And Jonathan Reynolds, our business secretary, has said Chinese companies will have to clear a high trust bar when investing in key sectors in the UK. It sounds like the British don't trust the Chinese that much, just like the Americans.
Well, I understand that that particular steel plant is losing a ton of money every day, and it's burning the balance sheet of the parent company, Jingye, and it probably reached a point that they cannot continue to support this plant. They want to see they are rid of this asset, or they can find a ready buyer to take it over from Jingye. I think maybe that's the better reading of the situation. I will be completely taken aback if, for example, there is any geopolitical consideration behind it, and the total demand in the British market for steel product from the Chinese perspective is really inconsequential. Don't overestimate the demand for steel in Britain. There are much better and larger markets in the world that China keep supplying with. That is the reality in the world of today.
Our Prime Minister is heading to Beijing shortly. What kind of a reception do you think he will get there? How inconsequential or consequential is Keir Starmer to China?
I personally believe Prime Minister Stammer will get the top reception in China, met by the Chinese premier and the Chinese president. The red carpet will be rolled out in his honor, partially because in China there are real admirations for what Britain as a country has done for the Industrial Revolution, globalization, you name it, even though we suffered some consequences of exchange with British for other reasons. Therefore, I truly believe this Prime Minister Stammer's visit to China should be the beginning of a new era of relations between China and Britain. Britain is faced with huge amount of problems. And I want to make one point with great assurance. China is one of the very few countries with the availability of capital, with the commitment for helping with the manufacturing side, with the size of the market in China, for example, we can really work together for miracles. And I think the trust between the two nations need to be built and continue to be renewed. Why should Britain and China not engage with each other for mutual benefit and should suspect each other for reasons that cannot be substantiated? I want to use this occasion to say China is not an enemy. You do not have real enemies among the Chinese people for Britain.
The red carpet wasn't rolled out for Vera Hobhouse this weekend when she was trying to go to China. She's a British parliamentarian. That doesn't really speak of friendship or trust, does it?
The organization she was affiliated is considered a very much anti-China. It has been sanctioned by the Chinese government because that organization keeps fabricating allegations against what China is doing in Xinjiang, which is part of China, and coming up with huge amount of false accusations against the Chinese nation. This is not tolerated. Anyone involved will not be allowed to enter China or China's Hong Kong or China's Macau. And don't play with fire because you do not know how much wrath there will be against such injustice they create against the decency and the dignity of China.
What does that mean?
That means they should stop whatever they are doing, fabricating situation, falsely accusing China in Xinjiang. Xinjiang is part of China. Other than those who agitate for so-called separatism or independence of Xinjiang from China, there are problems which can be solved very amicably. So those allegations about what they call atrocities, etc., are pure allegations. And that lady was involved in that. That is the reason why she is sanctioned. That is the reason why she is kept away from Hong Kong. And unless she changes, she will never be allowed into Hong Kong or any other part of China.
Can I just talk about the wider relationship with the US and China? Is President Trump playing with fire?
President Trump is playing with many things, many of his cards, but whether the cards he plays can really substantiate or materialize, that's another question. Now, if you are talking about the global trade war, he's launching this war against mankind as a whole, against the totality of the world almost. And China believes that regardless of the economic cost and losses to China, China needs to rise up to defend free trade. China will never allow any country, including the United States, to throw the rule of free trade out of the window and to be presumptuous enough to say, this is the way I do. I hold a gun at your hand, cry uncle, and kneel in front of me. No, China will never do that. Whether other countries will decide to do that, that's their choice. But China will never do that.
So do you think that President Trump misjudged China when he said that they had gambled and made a huge mistake, and yet at the weekend it was Donald Trump who lifted the tariffs on mobile phones and computers coming into the country?
Well, personally, I want to give President Trump all the respect he deserves as the commander-in-chief and the head of state of the United States. But a few days ago, people kept asking who will blink first. I said China will never be the first to blink. But the America blinked quite a few times, including reversing itself on one thing, another thing, then third thing. You never know what they will do to reverse themselves. If you do not call it blinking of an eye, tell me what does that term mean. Therefore, I think China's view is very clear. We will never tolerate anyone mistreating China like that, intimidating China, issuing ultimatum to China. If you slap me in the face, I slap you back. That is the tit for tat, and this is exactly what's happening. Now, Chinese government also declared by imposing 125% tariff against total U.S. export to China, the U.S. products have no marketability in the Chinese market, meaning they are ready to see an end to China-U.S. trade to the China export to the United States and vice versa. That is the ultimatum China is issuing to the United States. Don't mess with me. Otherwise, I close the market for you. You will be locked out of China. It's not China losing the US market. The United States runs the risk of being completely locked out of the China market.
Dr. Victor Gao, thank you very much indeed for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me. 谢谢.
The last questions are much more difficult. Like a memory question, it's like you'll go person, woman, man, camera, TV. So they say, could you repeat that? So I said, yeah. So it's person, woman, man, camera, TV. Okay, that's very good. If you get it in order, you get extra points. Okay, now he's asking you other questions, and then 10 minutes, 15, 20 minutes later, they say, remember the first question? Not the first, but the 10th question? Give us that again. Can you do that again? And you go person, woman, man, camera, TV.
That unforgettable moment from the 2020 election campaign was Donald Trump reminding us how cognitively perfect he was in terms of his memory. And he's just released another health report now, which shows that he is fully fit and manages high cholesterol well. And you'll be pleased to hear that the White House physician has basically signed him off as in robust and excellent health, which is part of a trend.
Can we do a brief history of Donald Trump and health reports?
Please.
December 2015, the doctor released, if elected, this is when Donald Trump's running for office, if elected, Mr. Trump, I can state unequivocally, will be the healthiest individual ever elected to the presidency. Now, that was released by Dr. Harold Bornstein, a doctor at Lenox Hospital in New York, who would later say...
Doctor of what?
Well, he was a gastroenterologist, as you asked.
Okay.
But he would later say, yeah, I didn't actually write that report. It was dictated to me to release to the press. Who dictated it to him? Yes, you've guessed it, Donald Trump.
Did he get a good job by any chance?
Now, well, the next
Is that okay?
the next person who released a medical when Donald Trump was president was this guy called Dr. Ronnie Jackson, who was the White House physician. He said in his report, Donald Trump would live to 210 if only he'd eaten better, and said he was 6'4", 240 pounds. And you thought, yeah, what, like an American football quarterback? Is that what you're trying to make us believe? And he said such glowing things about Donald Trump in this report that Trump was so thrilled. He recommended that this doctor, who'd had no managerial experience of anything whatsoever, should run the Veterans Affairs Department with one of the biggest budgets across the federal government.
It's not the best advert for American medicine, is it?
No, not really.
Ideal.
I mean, none of it is, because actually, I think what this is telling us is that you can have perfectly good health and perfectly okay cholesterol and still act in an intensely crazy, erratic, dangerous way. So it kind of makes the whole health question slightly arbitrary, doesn't it?
Well, I think we should feel reassured that the leader of the free world, the commander-in-chief of the most powerful army, is well, physically fit, cognitively able to lead us over the next 3 or 4 years.
And it's great we've got so much time to come as well. I mean, he's barely halfway through. If he gets to 210, he's not even halfway through yet, John. You might even last that long.
I will do. Definitely.
See you tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.